Today, it's thought that every experience we have alters the structure and or function of the brain in some way. The longer one does something or applies a particular set of knowledge, the stronger those pathways become.
So hello everybody and welcome back to Chasing Consciousness. Today we have the brilliant job of working out what neuroplasticity is all about. So 50 years ago, we mostly thought that the adult brain remained the same after reaching maturity, conditioned only by our inherited genetic predisposition. Now, among other discoveries, but particularly since the discovery that our neural networks remain plastic, which means adaptable, loads of research has opened up, fueled by perhaps our desire to really thrive and improve rather than just survive like we used to in the old days. That was enough in the old days, but now we want to thrive. And of course, along with the knowledge from the research, as so often with popular science, comes a host of exaggerations and kind of quick fix claims that prey on the wishful thinker. And today we're aiming to really sort the facts from the fictions and get our hands around what can actually change in our neural networks on into adulthood and potentially even into old age. And maybe even get hold of some tools that can really be used effectively to improve. So who better to discuss all of this with than developmental neurobiologist turned freelance science writer Moheb Costandi. He writes stories and articles for various popular publications like The New Scientist and The Guardian. His very well-known blog, Neurophilosophy, is often cited by important publications like the New York Times. And he's also the author of two important books. Firstly, Neuroplasticity, which we'll be talking about today from the MIT Press, and another book, his previous book, 50 Human Brain Ideas You Really Need to Know. So I am feeling really, really lucky after so long of wanting to really get my head around this, because I just think it's very, very useful, but also potentially easy to misunderstand. Finally, I get to answer these questions from a specialist. So I can't wait for this. Let's go. Moheb Costandi, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks. Thanks for having me on.
Well, thank you, sir, because this is, as I'm sure you know, having written a book on it, quite a bag of worms for the public to get their head around. Mo, I love to start by speaking to guests about the sort of beginning of their conscious experience when they're just getting into their teenage years. I'm always fascinated to hear, what were the first big questions that got you thinking as a teenager, that got you reflecting and may or may not have led you eventually into science? What do you remember about your first conscious reflections on the mind and on the human condition?
Well, I got into neuroscience after leaving school. Studying A-levels, I did an A-level in psychology, and I had a brilliant teacher who taught me about Broca and Wernicke's stroke patients, Sperry and Gazzaniga's studies with split brain patients, and so on. And that really got me interested.
So before we get into the facts and the fantasies about what we can and can't achieve, now that we understand a bit better neuroplasticity, perhaps you can start just by telling us what the phenomenon actually is, and maybe give us a bit of a timeline, because we've come a long way in quite a short period of time, haven't we, of the various discoveries that over the year have just completely changed the way we see plasticity in the brain.
Well, plasticity is a general term referring to the various ways in which brain structure and function are altered in response to experiences that we have. The idea that the brain is malleable has actually existed for over 200 years. So, for example, Charles Darwin in The Descent of Man, published in 1874, I think, wrote that the brains of domesticated rabbits are considerably reduced in bulk in comparison with those of the wild rabbit or hare, and this may be attributed to their having been closely confined during many generations so that they exerted their intellect, instincts, senses, and voluntary movements but little. Um, but for the most of the history of neuroscience, it was thought otherwise. In early part of the 20th century, the great Spanish neuroanatomist Santiago Ramon y Cajal wrote that once development is ended, the founts of growth dried up irrevocably. In the adult, the nerve paths are fixed, ended, and immutable. Everything may die, nothing may be regenerated. This idea that the adult brain is a fixed structure quickly became a central dogma of neuroscience, and it persisted for decades.
What was his evidence? What was his evidence of that? I mean, that's a pretty strong claim, isn't it?
Well, Cajal was a comparative neuroanatomist. By that time, he had spent decades comparing the fine structure of the nervous tissue in as many species as he could. And he had actually already received a Nobel Prize for his work, which he shared with Camillo Golgi about 10 years earlier. And so he was the main person that convinced the scientific community that the brain or nervous systems consist of cells like all other living things. For much of the previous century, there had been an ongoing debate about the structure of the nervous system, largely because earlier microscopes just weren't powerful enough to resolve the synapses, the minuscule gaps between nerve cells at which they communicate with each other. So for most of the 19th century, there was this debate between histologists and anatomists. One camp argued that brains must consist of cells like all other living things. Another camp, the reticularists, said, well, we can't see individual cells under the microscope. The nerve tissue looks like a continuous web, a reticulum. But it was Cajal who finally settled this debate using a staining method developed by Golgi, his co-recipient, who ironically was a reticularist. But because of Cajal's contribution, he's widely considered to be the father of modern neuroscience. So he had a lot of clout, shall we say.
Yeah, so he sealed the deal, and it remained that way for quite some time.
Most of the 20th century, evidence for plasticity began to emerge in the 1960s. There was a neuroscientist called Paul Bacchi-Rita who developed a crazy looking sensory substitution contraption that enabled blind people to see with their sense of touch. Excuse me. This device consisted of an old dentist's chair fitted with an array of large metal pins in its back and connected to a video camera. And the way it worked was to transfer the image from the video camera to this array of pins. And they would basically produce a tactile impression of the image from the camera, allowing the user to identify objects and discriminate boundaries and identify objects as the camera panned across the room. In the early 70s, a pair of researchers then discovered a physiological mechanism called long-term potentiation, or LTP. And this is a mechanism by which activity through a nerve circuit, if you like, strengthens the synaptic connections between cells to make the signaling between them more efficient over long periods of time. Then in the 90s came the discovery of stem cells, neural stem cells in the adult human brain, and that was the thing that finally convinced researchers that actually plasticity is it's actually the rule rather than the exception. And today it's thought that every experience we have alters the structure and or function of the brain in some way. Brain scanning, functional neuroimaging experiments show that this sensory substitution can actually occurs naturally. So, for example, the visual cortex at the back of the in the occipital lobe at the back of the brain, in blind people, this area, which would normally process visual information, can actually process auditory information from the ears and even touch information in braille readers. LTP is widely considered to be the cellular basis of learning and memory, and it's now widely accepted that the adult human brain produces new cells in certain discrete areas, although the significance of this neurogenesis, that's still a matter of debate. But we do know that certain pockets of stem cells in the adult human brain do continue to form new cells throughout the lifespan.
And Moheb, maybe just to give us a visual on this, because a lot of us, myself included, as just an artist who's curious about all of this, can you give us a kind of an example, like an image? You gave an example there of blind people. So they're let's say somebody goes blind at a certain point for some reason. the brain has to adapt, doesn't it? It has to find a way to make the best of it. And we now know that neuroplasticity is what that is. Can you just give us an example, a sort of visual example, so we can get a sense of what's actually happening with these individual neurons? And this idea of a pathway. Just talk us through exactly what changes, how it changes in such a way that we can kind of get an image of it.
Well, at the cellular level, we know that neurons come in all different shapes and sizes, but they all have a cell body. Most of them have quite an extensive, elaborate dendritic tree, fibers that emerge from the cell body. Dendrites means branches in Latin. Most have some number of dendrites, these fibers that branch out to receive inputs from other cells, and a single fiber projecting from the other side called an axon, which carries signals to other cells.
So those dendrites might connect with quite a few other neurons. It's not just one. It might connect with a host of them.
Yeah. Well, some cells have, all cells have one axon.
Mm-hmm.
Some cells have a single or just a small handful of dendrites. Others, like the cerebellar Purkinje cell, for example, have this very elaborate dendritic tree that might form connections, receive connections from hundreds of thousands, perhaps several million other cells. So Purkinje cells have this planar morphology, that they're flat like this, and they're the largest cells in the human brain, and they receive inputs from the granule cells, which are the smallest cells in the human brain, and they form axons that run this way perpendicularly through the dendrites of the Purkinje cell. And the textbook figure that the textbooks tell us that each individual Purkinje cell receives 250,000 connections from what are called the parallel fibers of the granule cells.
And can you clarify, do they communicate using electrical signals or electromagnetic signals? What exactly is it that passes through them?
No. The communication, the brain uses an electrochemistry. So the cells produce electrical signals, but the electrical signals can't jump across the synapse. So when they reach the synapse, they're converted into a chemical signal in the form of neurotransmitters, which diffuse across the synapse, and then and propagate across the synapse to generate an electrical signal in the cell that's receiving the signal. So if you can think of at the cellular level, you've got things called dendritic spines, and these are tiny protuberances that receive inputs from other cells. So cells can actually retract their spines, form new ones. Some connections can become stronger, some can become weaker. Cells can even retract entire branches of their dendritic trees and generate new branches. So there can be physiological changes. So the chemical, the electrochemical transmission can become stronger or weaker, or you can have morphological or structural changes where you have spines retracting or forming anew, or even entire branches withering or being newly generated. So that's at the cellular level, some of the mechanisms of plasticity.
Well, thank you so much, Mo. That is not an easy thing to describe, and if I've understood it, I'm pretty sure that the listeners have as well. It's always a good measure, check that the actor bloke understands, and I definitely got that. So I think that's pretty clear now. Just last little thing to clarify. Do neurons only exist in the brain and the brain stem, or do we have neurons passing off into other organs as well? Like, how extensive is the neurological system?
No, it's much more extensive than that. The nervous system in humans, overall, we can divide it into two components. So that the central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord. The spinal cord has pairs of nerves leaving each segment that supply the body parts with sensory nerves that receive information from the body and send it up to the brain, and motor nerves that send signals from the brain down through the spinal cord to the muscles to control our movements and autonomic functions. So the brain and spinal cord make up the central nervous system, and the nerves leaving the spinal cord make up the peripheral nervous system. Mm-hmm. But then you've also got nerves in other parts of the body. So the gut, for example, contains quite a complex network of nerve cells called the enteric nervous system, which controls the activity of the gut completely autonomously. That is without input from the brain. But the enteric nervous system can communicate, of course, with the brain, but it functions completely independently.
Well, that's something we're hoping to cover on the show, Mo. And, I'd be really interested to get your suggestions on the best sort of port of call for that, because there is a lot of talk these days about the third brain, the intestinal brain, and the importance of gut health for mental health and for sort of finding a sort of balanced state of being. And I'd be really, really interested to get that. But let's push on now. Now, listeners, all of this is covered in Mo's 2016 MIT book, which is just called Neuroplasticity. And he covers the full spectrum of research into this area and a lot more as well. And one of the things he does is he calls out some of the myths that have been kind of building up around this, as so often happens as science starts to spread out into the public, into popular science. And a lot of these have kind of been taken advantage for profit, for selling books, for selling workshops, brain stimulating devices, apps, you name it. And one of the objectives of this podcast, Mo, is really to try and put straight any of those distortions of scientific research and sort of get past the prejudice or the ulterior motives and just think about the data and not all the hot air. Tell us the main false rumors you came across researching the book, Mo. I mean, presumably there's quite a few.
Yeah. Well, they existed long before, and I didn't. One of the reasons for writing the book was to address some of these misconceptions. So the biggest single myth is that we only use 10% of our brain, and there are a lot of false claims about products or services that can harness neuroplasticity to release the rest of this untapped potential. So that would be the most common. What's
a more
one.
realistic figure, Mo, than 10%? What's the more? If you had
100%.
Right. Interesting.
Well, the brain is a very energy hungry organ. Our brains right now, the adult human brain, that is, consumes about one quarter of the body's energy supply, despite only being, I think, is it less than 10% of the body mass. So the brain uses a lot of energy, and in evolutionary terms, it just doesn't make sense to have this big blob in our heads that isn't really being used much, despite consuming so much energy. Now, we almost certainly use 100% of our brains.
Next myth.
Another very popular one is that some people are left-brained and some people are right-brained. That the left hemisphere of the brain is important for things like mathematical thinking and logical thinking, and that the right hemisphere of the brain is more creative and artistic, and there are lots of tests that can determine whether you're left-brained or right-brained, and people claiming that they can help you to use your left hemisphere more. You being an artist, would be a right-brained person. Me being a scientist would, be a left-brained thinker. If you like,
my head is leaning
bigger on
left,
that side.
definitely heavier. But listeners, seriously, we have a brilliant episode on this, speaking with the master himself, Mike Costandi, now in his 80s, still cracking on hard. He's just released yet another book, which we discuss in that episode. So do go back and listen to Mike Costandi, the father of left-right brain research, talking about that. And also, we're going to be speaking later on in the series to Dr. Ian McGilchrist, who, as a psychiatrist, speaks about a lot of that research and tries to work out really what the differences are and to separate the fact from the fiction. Obviously, controversial when you're looking to interpret the brain. Mo, is there anything else you'd like to mention there about perhaps some of the sort of wishful thinking elements, or maybe where some of this has been hijacked to try and make money?
Well, not regarding myths. Those are the two biggest ones, I think. But I would say that there's this idea that neuroplasticity is some kind of miracle cure. But that's for just about anything. But that's not the case at all. And in fact, knowledge, the knowledge that the brain can change in these various ways doesn't really empower us in any way. These changes are going to take place whether you realize it or not, and knowing that it's possible doesn't actually make it any easier to change one's behavior, which is can be a very, very difficult thing to do.
Absolutely. Just while we're still on this, shall we say, distortions of science, just as a journalist, I'm interested. You're the first journalist, science journalist we've had on the show. And I think it's really interesting to get the perspective of somebody who's an experienced writer in these matters and gets to evaluate the research from all different points of view. Do you get worried when you see science stories being hijacked for sort of financial or political reasons? I mean, you must see this all the time because journalists are very artful in the way they spin narratives for various purposes. Do you get worried about that?
No, I don't really worry about that or anything else, really. It's something I've trained my brain not to do because worrying achieves nothing but cause stress, unnecessary stress. But it's true that this term neuroplasticity has become a buzzword for motivational speakers and self-help gurus. And there are a lot of misconceptions about it. So you can do a quick internet search and you'll find thousands of articles about how to rewire your brain for love or happiness, success, leadership, wealth, and just about anything, and most of these claims are hugely exaggerated and completely unfounded, really. And I'm sure there are a lot of people a lot of honest people who just don't understand don't really know what they're talking about, but there inevitably are also people who know very well that they're shall we say bending the truth and exploiting others for financial gains. But no, I mean, I worry about it? No, I mean, there's no point. There'll always be people who are ready to exploit others, and there'll always be there'll always be people who are gullible enough to be exploited, and there's not much more I can really do about it apart from try to explain things properly as
Well, and
much as I can.
that's exactly what you're doing on your brilliant blog Neurophilosophy, and in all of these great articles, and in this very, very important book Neuroplasticity, because there are so many books out there that just really don't explain it at all well. But I do love your idea of staying relaxed about and not worrying too much about it. Maybe your next book could be called Neuroplasticity, and it could just be more sort of, let's just calm down and not get so triggered and argue so much about all of this stuff and just look at the facts. That's really what we're trying to do here. And I am the first to admit that I've fallen into the gullible hole on many, many occasions. And that's really one of the big reasons for this podcast, is just to sort of try and lay it out in a way that's kind of digestible and bite-sized. So, simpletons like myself who just really want to know, it's like, well, that sounds interesting and that sounds really useful. Let's find out if it's really useful or not. So, Mo, moving on, I think we've laid down more or less the basics and separated sort of the wheat from the chaff for the listeners. And I've got this one burning question that really motivated the whole interview. And it's been pinging around in my head ever since I started researching trauma. And this is it. Can the change of a neural pathway that, let's say, was grown in a traumatic childhood. So let's say that certain traumatic experiences, whether it might be a lack of attention, or maybe some sort of physical abuse, or leading to, let's say, later on in childhood into adulthood, it becomes ingrained in a sort of coping mechanism, like, let's say, disassociation or addiction and escapism, or in a few cases we've also got self-harming, these kind of we might say automatic reactions to a previous trauma. Can they eventually be altered? Can they be I use the word rewiring there, which is obviously the analogy with the electrical signals, but this idea of reprogramming or just updating, just changing the way the mind, the pathway the brain follows as it's trying to deal, just literally as a coping mechanism. Can it be changed over time, or am I just desperately, I need to let go of this idea?
Yes. The simple answer is yes, but it's important to realize that the consequences of any childhood trauma are themselves a result of plastic changes in the brain. That is to say, plasticity isn't always a good thing. It can be maladaptive and can lead to undesirable patterns of behaviour. As you said earlier, it's how the brain adapts to experiences and new circumstances and situations, and we all deal with things differently. So addiction is a perfect example of maladaptive neuroplastic changes. I mentioned this mechanism, LTP, long-term potentiation, where you have a strengthening of the signaling that occurs between nerve cells, and decades of research shows that addiction involves the strengthening of synaptic connections in the brain circuits involved in reward and motivation. Addiction is a maladaptive form of learning, which basically hijacks the brain's reward system, causing compulsive behaviors that are detrimental to our health and well-being. So we think of plasticity as the brain's way of adapting to circumstances and experiences, and it can have positive and negative consequences. The link between brain and behavior, it's bidirectional. It works both ways. Your brain controls your behavior, but your behavior alters your brain in some way or another. So yes, it is possible to reprogram, as you say, most behavior patterns.
And by the sound of it, the longer that any behavior lasts, so the longer that goes unaltered, I was going to say the thicker. I was imagining a bundle of neurons just getting stronger and stronger, like a muscle that's constantly trained.
That's probably exactly what's happening. Yeah.
And the longer it takes, presumably, the harder it would then be.
The harder it will be. Yeah. The more ingrained the behavior becomes, and the harder it will be to reprogram it, as you say. But I don't, I don't think it's, it's not sort of metaphor. When you say you imagine a bundle of fibers
getting thicker and
getting thicker, that almost certainly does happen literally.
Exactly. So that sort of, I mean, I guess my naive hope, and this is why I'm so happy to be speaking to you, Mo, thank you again. My naive hope is that there's some kind of feedback loop between mindfulness, which is sort of, shall we say, the ability to control our behavior, and neuroplasticity, sort of hacking into habits. Let's just call it hacking habit change. Can you clarify the neuroscience of habit changing? For example, I've heard that more or less it's about sort of 3 weeks, so 20 to 25 days, that it takes the neuroplasticity, the brain, the neurons to sort of begin to adapt and change, to adapt to a new behavior. In the context that we gave before, to sort of react and to become more efficient in the face of that new need of the brain. How long does it actually take for new actions we impose with sort of conscious, mindful deliberation to become part of habitual unconscious behavior, to become reflected in the new shapes of the neural pathways?
I've heard this 3-week figure myself. I'm not exactly sure where it comes from, but from a neuroscience perspective, that's it's perfectly plausible that repeating any behavior for some period of time will consolidate the connections and pathways involved in generating that behavior. So learning involves this strengthening and or weakening of specific pathways in the brain, and as we were just saying, that the longer one does something or applies a particular set of knowledge, the stronger those pathways become, and the more efficient they become at executing their functions, and as a result you become more adept at performing that particular skill.
So in that sense, it's not a mistake to say that sort of mindfulness, taking of control of behavior, can trump neuroplasticity, no matter how embedded. If you've got the will of mind, you can trump that behavior with mindfulness, and eventually, because neuroplasticity is reactive, it will adapt to do that, in theory.
Well, I mean, in theory, I mean, I can't. There's a lot of research about mindfulness, meditation. I'm not very familiar with it, but no, I would agree that changing one's behavior, patterns of behavior, patterns of thinking, and the two are, of course, very closely related, requires some degree of self-awareness, and requires strength of will and determination and perseverance. Yeah, of course.
Okay, well, I'm glad to hear, because I myself have been through, just in the last few years, a lot of addiction, dealing with addiction. And I was extremely surprised that just with sheer bloody will, I was able to do it. And here I am, a couple of years later, finding it really quite easy, surprisingly easy. And I can only think that by taking the reins for those first weeks, let's say months, there was something that was reacting in my head saying, okay, this is the new need. This is what the, Freddie's brain and body needs right now. And we need to react and change to associate that, even after years of abuse, which I was really surprised by. And I think there's a lot in here. Now, obviously, a lot has happened in the field since you've written the book. I mean, it was only 4 years ago that you wrote the book, and yet, this field is just accelerating. One thing that I heard that I thought you might want to comment on is something coming out of the Huberman lab at Stanford School of Medicine, that there's some evidence that when we see plasticity taking place, there's very often the presence of stress hormones like cortisol, in some sense, sort of jump starting, a bit like, you can imagine the heart attack machine, there's a defibrillator, boom, jump starting the creation of these new neurons, as if in an evolutionary sense, we needed that challenge, that push, that sort of stressful moment to have to face a new need to stimulate this beginning of this change in the brain. Have you heard about this? And also, what other research do we need to talk about that's just been coming up in the last couple of years?
I hadn't heard of this research, but it makes perfect sense to me, at least, and it's in keeping with this idea. It's not a new idea, but quite an important one, that emotions can play an important role in memory formation. So memories that are associated with strong emotions, particularly negative emotions, like fear, tend to be encoded much more strongly and remembered.
Presumably for survival reasons. It says, "Oh, don't do that again. Don't go near that."
Of course. Yeah, of course. Fearful memories tend to be encoded much more. What's the word I'm looking for? Strongly or efficiently than sort of neutral memories that of events that didn't really evoke a strong emotion of any kind. So it stands to reason that stress hormones would play a role in these processes.
What else has caught your attention in the field in the last couple of years since you put the book out with MIT?
Well, one important finding that has emerged in the past 10 years or so. So it's mentioned in the book, regards the microglia, which are the brain's immune cells. Now, these are cells that crawl around the brain tissue like amoeba and migrate towards sites of injury or infection to literally gobble up cellular debris or foreign bodies to protect the brain. And we know that these cells play an important role in a process called synaptic pruning. I mentioned earlier that one mechanism of plasticity, cellular plasticity, is that cells can change shape. They can retract their dendritic spines. They can form new ones. So new synaptic connections are forming and are being removed all the time. This is happening in our brain, in our brains right now, many thousands, millions of times probably per second. And we know now that these microglial cells, they migrate through the brain tissue, chomping away at unwanted synapses in the brain. This synaptic pruning, it occurs extensively during brain development and also during adolescence. But we also know now that it's a normal part of function in the adult brain. And a study published just late last year, maybe 4 or 5 months ago, confirmed that these cells, microglia, are responsible for synaptic pruning in the adult brain. And that's not entirely surprising given what we already knew, but it's an important confirmation nevertheless. In terms of new mechanisms, the most interesting recent discovery for me, also in the book, it's something that has emerged in the past 10 years or so, and it's plasticity in white matter tracts, which are the bundles of nerve fibers that connect distant brain regions to one another. So again, this is something that until very, very recently was thought to be static. The brain's white matter, it consists of a fatty tissue called myelin, produced by another type of other types of glial cells. In the brain, they're produced by cells called oligodendrocytes, and they produce these flat sheets of myelin, this fatty tissue, which wraps around nerve fibers like this to insulate them and facilitate the propagation of nerve signals. We thought that the production and distribution of this myelin remained completely stable once brain development is complete. We now know that's not the case at all, that myelin is continually being made, unmade, and redistributed throughout the brain, and that this is very important for brain function. So this is a newly discovered form of plasticity.
That reminds me of a question regarding old age, because obviously there's a lot of desire at the moment, particularly to deal with degenerative brain conditions like Parkinson's. Has plasticity shed any light on the possibility of, if not necessarily solving some of those problems, at very least protecting against them by trying to stimulate the continued recreation and renewal of neural pathways in the elderly? Are there some implications there? Have there been some positives from the research?
Yeah, yes, very, very much so. I mean, one, so as most of us, as we age, we experience this age-related cognitive decline. You know, for most of us, it's quite steady, a decline in various mental functions, and this is related to gradual degeneration of the brain, the consequences of age. Now, this process happens steadily in most of us. In some people, the so-called super agers, it appears not to happen at all. They seem completely resilient to the effects of age, whereas in others, it happens very rapidly, leading to mild cognitive impairment and then some form of dementia. But one of the implications for this research that has been going on for decades is that actually this isn't necessarily inevitable. There are certain things we can do throughout life to reduce the risk of developing, of losing it, basically, when we reach a certain age. So basically, some of us, we're the vast majority of us are going to start losing it at some point, and some of us will lose it, whatever it is, much more than others. Some of us will still be able to, hold on to it to some extent. But
give us an idea of some of these tools, some of these activities that would be recommended. I mean, I imagine for just general brain health, it's not necessarily only for those heading into old age. Presumably we all need this stuff.
Yeah, things like, I mean, as a general rule, whatever's good for your heart is going to be good for your brain and confer a neuroprotective effect. So regular physical exercise, a healthy, balanced diet.
What about the brain itself? I mean, like, for example, could doing Sudoku or reading a certain amount every day, using your visual cortex in a focused way, these kind of activities, do they keep those synapses alive?
Absolutely. Another important one is good sleep hygiene. Yeah. Sleep is very important. Socializing regularly, something that most of us can't do at the moment, of course, but that turns out to be very very important. Education is another factor that's thought to have a neuroprotective effect, and there's quite a lot of evidence suggesting that the longer one stayed in education, or the higher one's level of educational attainment, the lower is their risk of developing some neurodegenerative disease later in life. So these are things that leading a certain type of lifestyle, maybe not in childhood, but at least from middle age onwards, will probably be beneficial for later stages of life. And there's also evidence suggesting that for older people, learning a foreign language, or learning to play a musical instrument can be very beneficial for older people as well.
Oh, thank you, Mo. Those are really good thoughts, and not surprisingly, very general and cross lifestyle advice that actually promotes all good health, doesn't it? And no surprise that those elements, nutrition, physical activity, and stimulating your brain activity, that could be sort of pan health advice, couldn't it? So no surprises there.
It's advice that doctors have been giving their patients for a very long time, but it's once you develop, should we say, old habits die hard. It's not easy to change your patterns of behavior once they become ingrained.
Absolutely.
But it is possible.
And would you recommend any tools other than good old-fashioned, strength of will? Is there anything else coming out of the literature that could help us? I mean, a lot of people are using devices to track neural activity and nervous system activity. I mean, what's your feeling about this? Is it literally just mind over matter, or do you think there really are some valuable tools coming out?
Well, no, I don't like this phrase "mind over matter," because I think the mind is made of matter. So, no, I don't really recommend any devices. There are a lot of commercial devices available, brain stimulation devices and neuro feedback devices, and as far as I know, there's no real evidence that any of them are particularly effective at whatever it is they claim to do.
And nothing really replaces willpower, does it? I mean, we can have a very well ingrained habit, and really there's nobody's going to come along and change it for you except good old fashioned, this is what I'm going to do today, and it's not going to be what I've been doing for the last X years or whatever.
Exactly. Nothing's going to change unless you want to change it.
Absolutely. And it's sort of this idea of saying, listen, just because neuroplasticity has this wonderful feedback loop in, bidirectionality between, our behavior and our habits, that's like saying having a better internet connection improves the quality of information you're getting off the internet. It's like it's a bad analogy. Let's just notice.
No,
let's notice that functionality and use it. Just notice the functionality, use it. Say, listen, I only need to stick to this for a certain amount of time, and it's going to become my new life. And I think that's very empowering, just as a bit of knowledge. So we're coming up to the end now, Mo, and I just want to get a little bit philosophical here towards the end, just have a few reflections before we close. What are the implications of this for the evolution of the brain? I mean, this kind of level of plasticity we didn't really expect. Are there any limits to just how plastic the mind can be as we're now moving into a sort of exponentially changing post-technological world? I mean, we'll come on to that in a minute, but I just wanted to ask you, what are the implications for the evolution of the brain about this, just the sheer level of plasticity that we really didn't expect?
Well, it's not an easy question to answer. Of course, there are limits to what the brain is capable of. Like other things, it's subject to certain laws, the laws of physics, the laws of biology, and these will inevitably constrain what is possible. We have a pretty good understanding of the laws of physics. We don't really understand the laws of biology very well, and we don't know a huge amount about how physics applies to biology. To use an example of stimulating the growth of new brain cells, for example, we know that exercise, animal studies show that aerobic exercise stimulates the growth of new brain cells in a part of the brain called the hippocampus, and this may be the case in humans as well, but we don't know. But we can't, because we just don't have the techniques to study those processes in the human brain, right? But we know that exercise is good for health, brain health, and well-being. And we also know that certain types of antidepressants stimulate the growth of new brain cells. But I mean, would I jump at the chance of taking some new treatment that dramatically ramps up the growth of the production of new cells in my brain? No, I wouldn't, because that could have unintended consequences, like the development of brain tumors, for example. Neural stem cells are linked to development of tumors. So there are just so much we don't understand about the brain and how it works, and as we've discussed, the consequences of plasticity aren't always positive, and can be unintended and negative as well.
Well, it's very interesting, and I love the humility with which you speak there. And I think that the whole field of neurophilosophy, the sort of interpretation of that, really needs to keep that humility in mind. I mean, on this show, we're really promoting that kind of humility in the face of the unknown across the sciences, but very much important, as you said, in biology and neurobiology, where the brain is just such a complex a complex phenomena, complex structure, that it's really important that we keep an open mind when coming into all of this. And as you said, maybe take care with messing with it, which brings me on to my next question, which is something we're going to be examining a lot in the second series of Chasing Consciousness, which is questions about transhumanism. Now, a lot is spoken about artificial intelligence, about the exponential curve. We are already heading up this ever steeper curve, the possibility of eventually coming to a singularity. What are the implications of neuroplasticity for the future of machine learning and artificial intelligence? I mean, Elon Musk, up until recently, was a big alarmist about all of this. Now, in the last couple of years, he's launched Neuralink, which is a company that claims to already have the technology to insert artificial intelligence, should I say, connect artificial intelligence directly into the brainstem. Are there any implications for, given a really powerful amount of plasticity, which we've already established responds to learning, responds to stimulus, responds to different inputs? If we plug an AI that is clearly on an exponential curve of learning itself into a very, very almost infinitely flexible neural network, are we creating some kind of new species? And could those two neural networks learn in conjunction in a totally different way, in a way that an AI wouldn't alone or a brain wouldn't on its own?
Well, that's another difficult question. But I'll start by saying that I've never cared much for transhumanism. Say there's a lot of science fiction in some or many of the claims made by some transhumanists. Let's just leave it at that. So plasticity has no doubt played a huge role in brain evolution up till now. Nervous systems evolved hundreds of millions of years ago to enable organisms to learn from experience and adapt to their environments in order to improve their chances of survival and reproduction. Plasticity is an inherent property of all nervous systems, from the simple nerve nets of organisms like the hydra to more complex systems like the human brain. And an increased capacity for plasticity very likely played a role in evolution of the human brain, probably led at some point in the distant past in our hominin ancestors to changes in the course of brain growth, to greater numbers of brain cells, to the rates of formation of synapses and long distance connectivity. So plasticity certainly played a role in evolution of nervous systems, but at the same time, it's what nervous systems evolved to do as well. And plasticity will almost certainly be crucial to the continuing evolution of the human brain.
If you
But it's
introduce machine learning that has that kind of velocity of increase of data processing, of presumably plasticity would respond to accommodate that, wouldn't it?
well, I suppose so. But I think the capabilities of machine learning at the moment are vastly exaggerated. So I wouldn't worry about Skynet destroying humankind just yet. But I mean, microorganisms, viruses, bacteria, they can evolve very quickly to develop immunity to vaccines or antibiotics. But these are microbes that replicate very, very quickly. The kind of changes I think you're thinking about, with regards to evolution, take place over much longer periods of time, hundreds of thousands or millions of years. So I don't think, any
So we're not talking
technology
3 weeks to respond to the introduction of a Neuralink AI into our brains. Well,
no, we're not on the verge of becoming a new species just yet. But as for Neuralink, there's nothing particularly revolutionary going on there. It's not a new technology. It's been around for some time, and there are actually similar, more advanced devices already available. I think all Elon Musk is doing is commercializing them for the mass market. Now, cochlear implants, they plug directly into the nervous system. They've been around since the mid 1960s, but they haven't produced a subpopulation of people with superhuman powers. Then I think it's highly unlikely that any type of neural implant or other type of neurotechnology could do that either. And I think you need to also consider the possibility that technology may actually be detrimental in some ways to human brain function. According to the extended mind hypothesis, cognition can occur outside the brain, and of course we do outsource certain cognitive functions to our smartphones and other devices. Now, there is some research suggesting that our increasing reliance, for example, on GPS technology, may in fact be associated with the shrinkage of the hippocampus, this brain structure I mentioned a little while ago. It plays a very important role in memory, including spatial memory, and it also contains what could be called the brain's own GPS system.
Sense of direction.
But when was the last time you read a map? When was the last time you looked up a telephone number in your little black book and put it in working memory for 10 seconds while you dialed it? We don't do those things anymore, and that could be having a detrimental effect on how our brains work.
I'm almost certain that it is, Mo. And this is a fascinating area of discussion. And it's particularly interesting to discover that the brain interface technologies have been around longer than the more recent developments. And I think that's definitely going to be a very, very interesting topic for another episode. It remains only for me to say thank you so much, Moheb Costandi, for your time, for helping us to understand these highly loaded subjects that have been distorted by endless books and talks and YouTube bits and bobs for the sake of selling books and selling devices and selling apps. And I just think it's so wonderful to have the chance to sit down and just talk nuts and bolts without letting any of that get in the way. And I really, really appreciate for you helping me to sort of iron out the noise out of the signal here. And do go away, guys, and get that book, Neuroplasticity, out on MIT Press. I think it's something we all need to understand a little bit better, especially if we want to get into old age with good functioning minds, and also to be able to push back against some of the potentially more outlandish claims. So, Moheb Costandi, thank you so much for joining us, and wishing you all the best for the future.
A pleasure. Thanks for inviting me on.